How did Henry VII consolidate his power? Well, in this video I shall tell you, but first let's understand what the word consolidation means. When we look at consolidation, we are going to look at the three S's. The three S's are stable, secure and solid. And by that we mean, was Henry VII's control of the realm stable, secure and solid? Was his establishment of the Tudor dynasty and name stable, secure and solid? And finally, was his position as an indisputable, rightful and competent ruler of England stable, secure and solid? Further, were the English people uniting in his name? Eventually, once he went through, followed his aims and consolidated his power, were the people of England Team Henry, or were they #NotMyKing? Let's find out. Right, now we understand what consolidation means, we can move on to analysing and understanding how Henry VII consolidated his power and the steps he took in order to do so. So, this part is broken down to three different components. Firstly, we need to look at his personality. Secondly, we need to look at the immediate actions he took in order to consolidate his power. And lastly, we're going to look at the rebellions. However, the rebellion section is quite extensive, therefore it warrants its own video. So we're not going to cover that today, but we shall do in due course, so don't worry. Right, firstly, let's look at Henry's personality in relation to his consolidation of power. But to do so, we must first zoom out and have a look at his background. Where was Henry when he had just won the throne, and how did that play a role in what he decided to do, what threats he faced in the process of his consolidation of power? To help us understand that, I'm going to read a short section of the AQA textbook, which we will read through together and make notes on together, so don't worry, we've got this. Right, let's begin. Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, became King Henry VII of England following his victory over Richard III's forces at the Battle of Bosworth on the 22nd of August 1485. Right, this is important, so if you haven't done this previously, if you did not know, you need to make a note that the Battle of Bosworth was on the 27th of August 1485, and that is the battle Henry won to become king. You can make it any way you want. I like abbreviations, so to give you a hint, if you like, I did 1485 BOB. It's straightforward, it's quick, and it's street, so it stays in my head. Moreover, this is important because it gives us the first insight we have into why it was vital for Henry to consolidate his power and why there were threats against his power. There were threats against Henry's consolidation of power because Henry won the throne through brutal force. He fought for his right. He fought for his right to party. He wasn't supposed to be king. England at the time didn't want him to be king, but he won the throne. He forcefully won, or as Wallace McCaffrey puts it, he won that throne by conquest. Okay? To help you understand, imagine you were a leader, the top dog of a group. You are Mr., Mrs., VIP, right? And then suddenly someone that you don't know, not a lot, well, you know a little bit, but you don't know a lot about, barges in and it's like, I want to be leader, I want to get rid of you, I'm going to take your place, I'm going to replace you, let's fight, right? And so you suddenly, you fight, you throw down scissors, they throw down rock, and bam, in a split second, your life has ended, you're no longer leader, you have no power, you basically just gone, and they take over because of one futile battle. That's how Richard was feeling. That's how the English nobility, the English government rulers, if you like, were feeling. I use that term tentatively, but that's how the climate of England, the people in charge, were feeling. You went there. I was. You didn't know. I now told you. Think about it. That's what Richard was feeling. Anyway, moving on. So that victory, Henry's victory at the Battle of Bosworth, terminated the Plantagenet rule in England. For reference, the Plantagenet rule refers to the little burst of Yorkist monarchs that ruled England before Henry VII won the throne. As we know, the Yorks and Lancasters, which Henry was part of, were the two main noble houses, rival noble houses that were in the play of being monarchs. They were where the rulers were from, if you like. You can imagine it that way. And with Henry's victory and the termination of the Plantagenet rule, England saw the establishment of a new dynasty, who were, dun dun dun, the Tudors. However, Henry VII's grasp of power was insecure. This is important because think about how you would feel if you were insecure in your position. How would you act? Would you act out of paranoia? Would you act on a whim? Or would you act with your wits? Would you think things through? What would be going through your head if you were insecure? Right? Because he won his throne through conquest, Henry had no credible claim to the throne, and he made many enemies. He had many enemies, right? And those enemies were only too keen to see him experience the same fate as his immediate predecessor. Therefore, it was essential for him to consolidate his power by establishing his dynasty and ensuring that any rivals to the throne were dealt with firmly. Now that's important. That's really important because we just read why Henry VII must consolidate his power and what two ways he must consolidate his power through. So you need to make a note of that. How I would make a note of that is by writing a question like, what must Henry do in order to consolidate his power? And then underneath it, in a different colour, or by splitting my page on two and having the question on one side, answer on the other, have the answer, establish his dynasty, so marry and have an heir and a spare. That's easy and nice to remember because it rhymes, heir, spare, heir, spare, heir, spare. And secondly, he needs to eliminate the threats by Yorkers. So you can do it like that, or you can just make normal notes, or you can, like, if you want to draw a graveyard and write Yorkers on a tombstone, that's fine too. You do you. Right, so to summarise, Henry needs to consolidate his power. The main reason we have learned is because of the way he won his throne, because of the climate of England, sorry, can't speak English, but, or proper grammar, use proper grammar. Anyway, to summarise, Henry won the throne by conquest. This was a problem because the climate of England at the time was mainly his rival house, and so he had to establish his power and his right to rule alone and probably was due to face many rebellions against him, as we will find out soon. The two main ways in which he could consolidate his power and should consolidate his power through were by establishing a dynasty and eliminating threats. Right, so one reason it was vital to Henry to consolidate his power was because his position in power was not secure. His position in power was not secure because he had no legitimate right to be in that position. He was only in that position because he won it through brutal conquest. Understood? More reasons why Henry's consolidation of power was vital we shall now discover as we read on. Right. Henry VII had not been brought up to rule. Pause. That's important. Lock that in your head. This is important because if Henry wanted to establish himself as a competent leader, effective leader, and establish his power as such, he needs the skills. He needs to know how to do that. But if he was not taught the skills like previous monarchs were, he is going to be seen as weaker as those previous monarchs. Therefore, it is more likely that people are going to challenge him and his position because he is not showing that he is fit to rule. Therefore, the fact that Henry was not brought up to rule means that it is vital for him to consolidate his power, or at least learn how to do so. Moving on, in 1471, when Henry was 14, who ruled? Who ruled before Henry ascended to the throne? Good, the Yorkists. Who was the Yorkists, the House of York's biggest rival? Yes, correct. The House of Lancaster was York's biggest rival. Therefore, during that period, Henry was not allowed in England. When he was 14, only 14, a battle took place called, and I won't be able to pronounce this correctly, but called, presumably, the Battle of Tewkesbury. That's Tewkesbury. Tewkesbury. This caused the Lancastrians to go into exile. Therefore, Henry was forced into exile when he was only 14. And where was he forced to flee to? Brittany, in France. Okay? Now, this is important for understanding his consolidation of power and his problems when he was trying to consolidate his power, because if he wasn't in England for at least a decade before he decided to be the ruler of England, that is a problem, because he's not going to know the climate of England, how to rule England, what being the ruler of England entails. Therefore, he is not, like we said previously, a competent or going to be a competent leader. He has a lot of skills to learn, and he needs to learn fast, otherwise his throne is going to be snatched away from him just as quick, if not more so, than when he snatched Richard's throne off him you know, threw down the rock when Rich threw down the scissors. So he needs to hurry up, because in this point in time, as historian Wallace McCaffrey says again, he is a stranger to England as soon as he ascends the throne, and he needs to sort that out. He needs to consolidate his power, and he needs to do so fast. Right, now we know that, I think it will be good for you to pause and think about what we have covered so far, and think about if that was you, if you from age 14 spent your years in exile training to take over the throne of England one day, but not really having any political training at all on what it actually takes to take a leader, only really military training. If you find yourself in a position of power by force, by going against the climate, what problems would you face? What personality would you have? What character traits would you have? What would you be thinking? I think it would be good for you to sit down, pause the video, and make a list of these things. Empty your brain out of these things. Quickly jot down some of these things, some characteristics you think Henry would have, or Henry does have, from the life he has had, from the position he is in. I list, mind map, whatever you need to do. I can go through some things now, some characteristics that are pinpointed in your textbook that he is. So a lot of people say that Henry had a shrewd personality. Shrewd means that you're quite sharp, quite intelligent, but also quite cold. You don't take your feelings or other people's feelings into consideration. You just do what you have to do. Whoever is harmed in the process is harmed. That these other two characteristics are linked to that. Calculating, he obviously knows how to act in a period of crisis. He knows how to act on his feet. He spent years in exile, so he is clearly smart enough to snatch someone's throne when the majority of the climate, the majority of people are against you. He is calculating enough to arrange an army and take that throne. To succeed, even when the majority is against you, is something that you have to be very clever to do. And he's stoic. You might have come across that word in English literature if you study that. Victorian period, we normally associate it with. It means he doesn't show his emotions. He doesn't let the emotions get back to him. He's shrewd, basically. He doesn't show his emotions. Level-headed again, because he's stoic, he's shrewd, he's calculating. He probably thinks the life he had through exile, his struggles, he probably thinks things through. He probably tries to keep a steady head, even though, think about it, you've had nothing. You've been through exile, and suddenly you have the whole world, a whole country at your feet. Literally, he has a whole country at his feet. He has all this wealth. There's a debate that we're not going to get to in this video, but if you would like, I could do another video on it, on him being a miser, which means, is he a Scrooge or was he not a Scrooge? Bah humbug. Can you imagine him saying that, or can you not? So maybe level-headed, maybe not. Possibly kings are, or you imagine them to be, quite arrogant because, like I said, they have all the riches in the world, they have a whole country or more at their feet. Self-reliant, as we said, he's a stranger in England. He has to be self-built because he's basically alone. Basically, we know, or you will know soon, that he wasn't a fan of nobles. So he just has himself, basically. He has to be very, very self-reliant. And as we said, and the historian Thomas Penn says that his time in exile taught him how to think like a fugitive, which basically means that he could be resourceful and he had the ability to think on his feet, as I sort of covered before. So your turn, jot these down, do whatever you have to do to think about or learn what Henry's personality was. Right, personality done. Now we can move on to the immediate actions Henry took to consolidate his power. The first action we're going to look at is the fact that he dated his reign from the 21st of August 1485 rather than the 22nd of August 1485. Now this was clever of him because by doing so he showed that his right to be king was not due to his victory or some battle, but rather it was his sole birthright. Because what happened on the 22nd of August? Good. He won the throne through battle. The Battle of Bosworth took place on the 22nd of August 1485. However, by dating his reign one day before that, he showed that he did not win that battle through conquest, but instead that throne was his all along. Secondly, Henry also gave out 11 knighthoods. Now you might be thinking, how does this help Henry to consolidate his power? Right, so if we think about it, if you studied any literature from this period, if you've done any Shakespeare before, you will know that status in Tudor England or medieval England was very, very important, right? It was all about reputation, reputation, reputation. To quote Cassio from Shakespeare's Othello, see, when you do my lessons, we do a bit of everything all together. We multitask. Anyway, that we went a bit off topic then. So, like I said, status was everything then. And so if someone elevates your status, you're no longer Mr., you're now or master, you're now sir. You suddenly have this level of prestige and importance and status that you didn't have before. And these 11 people that Henry gave these status can't speak English once again, that these 11 people of which Henry gave this elevated level of status to are now, in some respects, if you like, are in debt to Henry because they owe him for the status he gave them. Therefore, this helps him consolidate his power because it means that they are more likely to side with Henry, to listen to Henry, and less likely to join rebellions against Henry or organize rebellions against Henry. Secondly, he detained nobles of whom had a greater claim to the throne than him. Now, this is important because we know that Henry was a stranger to England, as historian Wallace McCaffrey puts it. And we also know that the monarchy, the house in charge before Henry, was the House of York. So all nobles are from the House of York. And for a very long time now, the House of York made up the English monarchy. So the people sided or saw the monarchs of York as being the rightful monarchs of the country. Therefore, by detaining two and more people who had a greater claim to the throne than he did, he is in a way eliminating that threat, which in turn reduces the chance of rebellion and pretenders against him. Here, we are noticing that he detained Elizabeth of York, who will later go on to become Henry VII's wife, which we'll touch on in a second, and the Earl of Warwick, also two very important noble figures. Fourthly, the thing that Henry did in order to immediately consolidate his power was that he organised his coronation on the 30th of October. Now this is important because the first meeting of Parliament took place on the 7th of November. So by dating his coronation before the first meeting of Parliament, it shows that, again, like the idea of him dating his reign one day before the Battle of Bosworth, this action is also him showing that his kingship, his right to the throne, is through birth, not through conquest. But here specifically, it's through birth, not because Parliament sanctioned it. So by organising or ascending to the throne, having his coronation before the first meeting of Parliament, he's showing that he has the crown because it's his right to have it, not because Parliament sanctioned it. Additionally, another thing Henry did was that he married Elizabeth of York, and soon they had Prince Arthur of Wales. Now, this is obviously important. Going back to the very first thing we said during the lesson, this is important because now he's consolidating his power by doing one of the two most important things we touched on, which is securing a dynasty. He now has a son, he has an heir to the throne. Now, what a lot of people get caught up on is dates, like when did he ascend the throne, when was Arthur alive, when did this happen, when did that happen, and I know I surely was. The thing is that specific dates don't really matter, but it still sounds nice, so you get your examiner on your side, because you sound like you know what you're talking about the more dates you use. So the way I like to remember key facts or statistics is little rhymes. So the one I use, which is, you might think is a bit pathetic, but the one I used to remember when Arthur was born was in 1489 Prince Arthur was alive, because it rhymed for me back then. Don't know if it still rhymes now. In 1489 Prince Arthur was alive. In 1489 Prince Arthur was alive. Half rhyme. Anyway, so by getting married and having a son, the House of York and the House of Lancaster are now united, and so there's less chance of rebellions because both sides, both rival houses, have come together and finally. Great. Now we can move on to other immediate actions Henry took in order to consolidate his power. We are going to look at two pieces of legislation Henry enforced in order to consolidate his power. Now, when we're looking at these types of legislation, there are mainly two reasons for them. Firstly, they were for him to get money, because obviously the crown had been unstable. There wasn't a lot of money in the treasury at that time, and so he needs all the money he can get in order to create the stability England needs, in order to secure his dynasty, in order to be a key player in Europe, in order to fight the wars and win the wars he wants to fight, and all those other kingly things. And the other reason, or important thing to remember when we look at these types of legislation, is that most legislation was also to control the nobility, because remember, as we said, even though we have this symbol of the Tudor Rose and unity between rivals and peace and stability, in reality, it wasn't as smooth as that. And so there's still rivals to the throne. There's still the threat of Yorkist nobility rising against him and trying to take his throne off him. And therefore, a lot of legislation was put in place in order to control the nobility and minimize the threat they had to his power. If you want to think about it, think of like the carrot and stick, if you are familiar with that analogy, and think that the knighthood, giving titles, is the carrot way, the reward way of Henry keeping people on his side, and then the legislation, the debts, the acts against the nobility as being the stick, the sort of punishment way of getting people on his side, because both work. Yep, that basically summarizes it. Good. The one that we're going to look at first is the Acts of Attainder. Now, the Acts of Attainder did several things. If it was sanctioned against a noble, that noble was proclaimed guilty of rebelling against the monarch, which was treason, which means they could be now imprisoned, they could lose their head, they had everything taken off them. It was end times. RIP for that monarch, that noble, or that person that had the Acts of Attainder put in place against them. So yeah, the Acts of Attainder declares a landowner guilty of rebelling against a monarch. He lost his title, his lands, his head, and if he had heirs, if he had sons, then those would be disinherited, they were no longer his. The other bit of legislation we are going to look at is tonnage and poundage. I can never say, never really knew how to say that properly, but I'm going to say tonnage and poundage. And this was a form of tax, basically, a way for him to raise revenue, while Acts of Attainder was all about getting the nobles under his control. This one is more about him getting the money. And yeah, it was a tax which allows him to raise revenue for the whole of his reign from imports and exports. So imports, things coming into the country, and exports, things coming out the country. By that dynamic is part of trade. And yeah, one of the reasons he was so desperate for money to raise revenue was because of the period of war and instability that took place before he ascended to the throne, and he was trying to create that stability. As we learned at the beginning, he's trying to consolidate his power. Right, so that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the lesson. I hope this was helpful. I hope it made sense. I hope it was clear, and I hope it wasn't too boring. And hopefully I shall see you next time as we continue looking at how Henry VII consolidated his power. And specifically, we're going to be looking at the rebellions. And I just hope you're all well and have a lovely day, and good luck in your exams, or enjoy learning about all of this because it's super fun. Bye!